So the major players that we're currently seeing in the NFT space are the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, and the Office of Foreign Asset Control, or otherwise known as OFAC. Now, there are other people who are playing in the space, but what you'll notice is these are the ones that are primarily driving regulatory requirements. They do not all agree on how they talk about NFTs, classify NFTs, or use the same vocabulary. So that's really important to know, because if you're reading through SEC documentation, which we'll get into in just a minute, they don't talk about NFTs the same way the IRS does. So just keep that in mind, that it depends on what you're doing as to what vocabulary they're using. So when we get into talking about regulatory bodies in the US, one of the big things that's driving NFT projects and cryptocurrency investing is whether or not your community has an expectation for profits. You've probably heard about this with the Howey test. Now, if they do have an expectation for profits, your product probably needs to be registered with the SEC as a commodity. If there is no expectation, or I'm sorry, as a security, registered as a security with the SEC. If there is no expectation for profits, then you're probably a commodity and you probably don't need to do registration. But that's something that you should talk to your counsel and your legal advisors about. So when there's no expectation for profits, we get involved with the CFTC, and they're dealing with commodities, right? So they're the ones that are going to be protecting your community from maladaptive practices like false advertising, usurious practices like we saw with Frosty's NFT. So what they're looking for there are deceptive and manipulative practices, false promises, and things like that, where they're just ripping off the community. So the CFTC is going to be the one that's going to be the major player that's going to be looking for whether or not your project is damaging the community. If there is an expectation for profits, then you need to register with the SEC, and there are reporting requirements. It's not that you can't get registered with the SEC, it's that you ought to. There are quarterly and annual reporting requirements. Additionally, you're going to have to update the SEC anytime you make major changes to your project or your product. So that's really important. One of the areas where we get into, and this is important for your white paper, if you're doing white papers or roadmaps, is around fractionalized NFTs. That's where we take a particular item and we divvy up the ownership using NFTs. So you use your NFT as a percentage representation of the ownership of the final product. So that's called fractionalization. And in that instance, you are definitely probably wading into security territory. You probably should be registered, and you probably should have a prospectus that's done every quarter. With profit and royalty sharing, that's important to note, because profit and royalty sharing, we see that a lot being promised in NFT projects, where a portion of the community profits will be given back in a percentage manner. Again, that almost looks like fractionalization of a company. So again, profit sharing, royalty sharing, you're probably wading into commodities or into security territory, and you probably need to be working with the SEC. So how about the IRS? The IRS is in a completely different ballgame. They have very different vocabulary. They don't care about whether or not the SEC views you as a commodity or as a security. What the IRS is looking at is ordinary income versus capital gains, capital loss. And recently, what we've seen in the conversation in the last 2 weeks develop is whether or not your NFT is considered a collectible. Collectibles are going to be taxed at a 28% gain, whereas capital gains and losses are typically taxed at about 15 to 20%, and ordinary income is taxed based on whatever rate you're at with your overall income standards. So the quick breakdown on ordinary income versus capital gain and loss, if we're following this pattern rather than the collectible, is that when you mint the NFT or when you receive the NFT, the value at the time that you receive it in US dollars, not whatever cryptocurrency you paid for, is going to be the ordinary income. And then the difference between the time you receive it and the time that it leaves your hands is when it is the capital gain or capital loss. So we are seeing the IRS try to move a little bit more towards collectible territory. I'm guessing that that's because they know that there's a slew of losses that are going to be claimed from this last year with the crash in the market. So it'll be an interesting play out over the next year to see how the IRS deems all this stuff. But that's to keep in mind that there is different vocabulary with the IRS, and they are not concerned with whether or not you're a commodity or a security under the SEC standard. And then we have the Office of Foreign Asset Control. So what do they have to do with everything? Office of Foreign Asset Control is a governing body in the United States that regulates who we do financial interactions with. And by virtue of our citizenship as US citizens, we are required to comply. It's essentially a way that we financially bully other countries in order to maintain order in the world. I know that sounds really nice, doesn't it? But they regulate financial embargoes. So when we go into conflict with other countries, the first thing that we do politically is we incur financial embargoes in order to reduce trade practices. We saw this happen just this last year with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It becomes important because now that we're doing peer-to-peer transactions on blockchains with crypto and NFTs, we as individuals are actually responsible for complying. And when you're in the fiat world, typically your credit card company or your banking company will actually do the OFAC compliance part for you. They will validate that the incoming transactions and the outgoing transactions are acceptable entities for you to be transacting with. But now that we're on blockchain and we're doing it peer-to-peer, we're doing it directly, we need to be verifying. So if you are minting an NFT project or dropping a token, you should probably go to the OFAC website and put on your list of accounts that you cannot interact with in your smart contract in an effort to avoid violating an OFAC requirement. So other regulatory bodies that we are seeing that I did not talk about because this is a very, very high level is Department of Justice. They're enforcing of the law, so they're what CFTC and SEC interact with in order to launch their lawsuits. We have the Bureau of Consumer Protection, and they do the consumer complaints and investigations that usually gets handed over to the DOJ. And then we have state-level entities, so don't forget, just because we've done a high-level overview of federal entities doesn't mean that your state doesn't have additional rules and regulations. I know the state of New York and the state of Texas both are very active in this space. Quick disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving anybody financial advice or legal advice. I'm a policy analyst, so I'm giving you just a quick rundown of the different regulatory bodies. That's for all the lawyers in the room. Got you covered. And then I'm on pretty much every social media platform. I go by Links Helic online, so if you're looking for me, that's how you can find me, and that's my presentation this morning.
Thank you. That was phenomenal.